Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Guy, it's so good to have you back on the podcast. You and I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I got to share the idea of the Shimmer with you, and you started riffing off of that idea by talking about Heidegger. It was one of the best conversations that I have had in a long time. I really was hoping that you could just teach me more about Heidegger and how you see it connect to the Shimmer.
Yeah.
And so for people listening, this podcast is for me. I'm being selfish today, but I think that you guys are going to like it because you guys don't get to see me in this type of mode because I'm normally interviewing. But this is going to be jazz. Guy, thank you so much for coming on, and I can't wait to see where this goes.
Me too. Me too. I appreciated how you spoke directly to the audience, right? And set up the conversation talking about jazz. Who is it? What kind of folks are your folks that are watching this?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is I don't really know. Like the truth is, like I of course have met quite a few of them, but in my mind's eye, there's been a like Jung has this idea of the imago Dei, like our inner image of God.
Mhm.
And like as an artist, I've been talking to some combination of my 21-year-old self, which was the part of me that needed the most help. But I'm also talking to my children who aren't alive yet, and I'm talking to my muse. And it feels like all of those
Yeah,
mix into one, and whoever are the actual people listening, it seems like they've resonated with that homunculus.
totally. Especially if we think about that all speech is a kind of a response to a listening, right?
Yeah,
Like in a deeper sense. It's like in some way we find out through what we say who's listening.
yeah, for
And
sure.
the part I don't like about that is by the time I find out who's listening, I'm already in the listening, right? That sometimes that's really good news, sometimes that's embarrassing. But there's something I've noticed in conversations on my YouTube channel and stuff like that, that there is this kind of, it's really interesting. Like when the listening is overtly anonymous, there is a real anonymity to who we're speaking to in some sense. And it's an open question for me, actually. What is this thing that we're doing? What is this conversation that we're having? And what does it mean? What does it mean to that we're going to share a conversation? On one level, the thing that excites me about this is that I can almost define my life by a series of epic conversations. If the conversation didn't evoke the fundamental shift, it shortly followed, right? The fundamental shift, right? There's something about the way that we become in and through conversation, right? And through each other is huge. But this idea that we can have a conversation and then share it, right? Is so
Yeah.
interesting. Is so interesting.
Yeah, and it's like when I track back my life, like quite a few of my biggest turning points in my early adulthood was because I got to listen to podcasts
Yeah.
and I got to hear people talk to each other with a type of attunement to each other about ideas that was so foreign to anything that I had ever heard in my entire life. Like the first podcast I ever listened to was between Joe Rogan and Aubrey Marcus, and this was 13 years ago. The thing that struck me was that it was two adult men who I could tell loved their life and had built a life that they loved. And that for me, I think I was 19 when I first heard that, I had never heard a man talk to a man in a with a tone that they enjoyed their life. I had literally never heard that before. Being able to eavesdrop on those two types of nervous systems that like changed the horizon of what I thought was possible.
That's it. That's, yeah, that to be struck and tuned into,
Yeah.
like an attunement, is something. I think that's actually, that makes the way that you put that makes a lot of sense. This way that where something in the dialogue that you're listening to strikes one, calls to one. And it's interesting because it's an interesting call because, like you said, you'd never experienced that.
Yeah.
Yet you recognized it.
Yeah. Wow. That's blowing my mind. And we're early in the podcast, and that is blowing my mind. Yeah.
Mhm.
Huh.
So there's kind of ways in which, in some sense, we're talking about, like, I think probably what we're going to be talking about a lot about is technology, right? Um, I think,
Right. Because conversation is actually a technology too.
yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, so one of the things that struck me about and maybe we want to start a little bit with this too, is I've been thinking a lot about what you talked about with the shimmer. And I think the thing I want to appreciate and acknowledge is that there's something you gleaned, right? There's, on one level, there's the movie, which is just amazing. But then there's that you saw what you saw, right? That you can catch it, right? And follow its thread and draw out of it. I just want to acknowledge whatever that is in you that can be caught that way and drawn to it. So that last conversation, I've been thinking about the shimmer. And like I sent you thoughts that I had about it.
Epic.
But it really opened it up just so people can have a basic understanding of it. If you were to sum up the shimmer and
Yeah.
what the shimmer is, so people can know what we're talking about a little bit.
Yeah, so the shimmer is the totality of the spaces that our attention can fuse with that is digital. So it's like the totality of the digital world. And I think that the key thing is it's a new world that didn't exist for Plato or Socrates or Buddha or Jesus. It's like a new dimensional space, and it's collided with our life in such a way that most of us don't notice it. And we don't appreciate how much it has radically changed everything. To not learn how to use it is probably it kills people. And we can talk about that. But to learn how to use it, also, it's like the new great exponential tool to spread new stories and new myths. And so it's a wild time.
Yeah. And the way you opened it up last time was like that. The way you talked about it is like just recently, it just happened. An alien species basically landed, right? And you framed it in such a way that for as long as we can remember, the world that we've lived in is basically like space, time, and space. And then all of a sudden, a new
Yeah.
species landed on the planet called the internet, essentially.
And the thing that's so potent about the movie Annihilation is that the alien thing that hit was actually a environment. It wasn't so much an entity as it was a environment.
Yeah.
So we got hit by something, but it's not
Yeah.
just entities that came off of this. It's like a fungal thing that came off of a rock, and that it's transforming the environment, and we enter into it every day without realizing it.
Yeah. And that's the thing about it, is I really appreciated the way that you said it and hit me at the time, and it's been hitting me since, of that Yeah, there is something that goes on in technology, right? In not necessarily technological objects, right? But more in the sense of that what has been culminating for years is what Heidegger talked about is a mode of the dominant mode of being
Yeah.
is technological in nature, right? And he really did he profoundly I was that he was able to see that, right? And track that and disclose that is was really uncanny because one of the hardest things to see is what you're ensconced in, right?
Yeah.
And especially with technology, because technology is so interesting in that it's one day there was a whole period of time where we didn't have all the world's information in like a box in our pocket available at any point, right? It was like most of life, there was not that. And then all of a sudden, there was a box in the pocket, and it stayed novel for about 6 months. And then it just disappeared in some sense. Like there's this kind of way that
Yeah.
technology really disappears. But when it
Yeah.
disappears so deeply, those things that kind of go into the background, and the background becomes the thing from out of which you stand from. And there's something really interesting about the way technology disappears like that.
Yeah, an image that comes to mind that feels like it might help people connect to is if you imagine those like fractal Mandelbrot sets where you're looking at like a shape. Technology has this capacity that once you look at that thing, you get sucked into it and it becomes the frame
Yeah.
and you don't see it anymore. But everything that you see within that frame is dependent on the thing that you just got lost in. And so there's this falling into,
Yeah.
and yeah, like a big question is what are the invisible implicits that we're taking for granted because of the technology that has vanished?
Yep. And there's, in some sense, that human beings have worlds with foregrounds and backgrounds, right? So there's nothing new about that. That's just what it is to be human. However, there's an extra something or other that comes along with technicity, right? And that's one of the things that really struck me about what you were talking about when you saw the mythopoetic, I think you named it the mythopoesis of technology, right? Like something about the way that movie portrayed this way where, what is it exactly? Like you talked about the crawlers, you had these distinctions where it's this doubling that kept happening,
Yeah.
right? But it's reaching towards us, but it's reaching towards us not in some normal way that it's like it has some
Yep.
desire for us in some way. It's really, it's got some kind of intent, I think,
Yeah.
but it's very difficult to bring that into language.
Yeah. So for people who haven't seen the movie Annihilation, which is where I was able to pull the idea of the shimmer from, the apex of that movie is a scene close to the end that still gives me goosebumps every time that I watch it. And I think what, cause I'm getting goosebumps right now because I'm remembering the image. I've tried to deconstruct for myself why does this scene, like, it's not haunting as much as it is, it's like a awe response. It's like a full awe response. And for people who haven't really thought about awe, some awe is awesome. Like a little bit of awe feels great. And that's why we say awesome. But complete awe is what Jung called the mysterium tremendum. And that's what we call awful. Full awe is transcendent and simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The scene at the end of that movie is there's this creature that basically starts to take on a human form after it gets some of the blood of the main character. Because before it got the blood, it was this psychedelic amoebus, and then it absorbs a drop of blood from the protagonist, and then it turns into the form of a human, but it has no face. And it can't help but be a mirror to the protagonist. And it's not predatorial, like it's not trying to kill her, but with every move she makes, it mimics the move and it comes 1% closer. And so it has this really weird thing where I think in our evolutionary biology, the only archetype that we have to try to grok that type of intent is a predator. Like for something to transfix its entire attention on us and to move towards us and it not be us, because it could be mating, but when it's something that's not us, that's completely transfixed on us, that's trying to come towards us, the only archetypical image that we have for that is predator.
Yeah.
But this thing doesn't, and I think what's so beautiful about that movie that makes it so mythologically deep is that it's not exactly predatorial, but it definitely has a intent and it has the type of transfixedness that we only can attribute to a predator. But it
Yeah.
seems like it's just irresistibly compelled to merge with whatever comes inside of it and to replicate it.
Oh, no. It's as we're talking about it, I just keep trying to, there's something that really bucks words to it, speech to it, yet it bucks speech completely, right? There's something
Yeah.
like most of the things that unfortunately interest me are has that characteristic, right? It's like those things
And
that
I think that's a
call,
great,
yeah, that yet buck the words they call that sense. And there's something about this strange way where as we're looking at this, we're trying to really, it's almost like we're presented with a different kind of otherness, right?
yep,
And in some sense, like from a kind of a Heideggerian way of looking at things, right? He would say that technology is a way of comporting the world, that the world shows up as what he calls a standing reserve. That 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 the technological understanding of being, or in German, the word that he used was Gestel, right? It isn't technological objects, right? It's the thing underneath that, where the essence of technology has become the kind of background, presupposed understanding of being, that anything that is shows up as a standing in reserve, awaiting our use, our optimization, right? Our
right.
exploitation through a kind of instrumental rationality, right? That's disposability, right?
Yeah, it feels like the image that comes to mind is technology implies the magician archetype of everything, that we have a wand and that we can change it to our will.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah, totally. And that here's the thing that it's this is subtle, but I spent some time like knowing we were going to have this. I spent some time like listening to my friend Johannes, who has a YouTube channel. He's a Heideggerian scholar, wrote a book on Heidegger and death and all kinds of things, and he was really getting into the way that Heidegger is misunderstood with this word Gestalt.
Would you be willing to give like intro, like just a quick intro, like I did with the Shimmer to Heidegger?
So Heidegger, I would say, is most people would say whether or not they like Heidegger, they hate Heidegger, or they love Heidegger, and everything in between. Most of them would say that without a doubt.
Real quick, I do think it's just worth acknowledging that most people listening probably don't know who that is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. He's a philosopher. I think he was born in the like late 1800s in essentially in a small town in the Black Forest in Germany. He grew up in the late Middle Ages
Yeah.
in this small town in rural Germany where the Catholic Church was in the middle. He was raised to be a priest, the whole nine yards, scholasticism, Thomaicism, and all that kind of stuff. And so, in some sense, Heidegger, if you can get a sense of this, like for Heidegger, his experience of modernity was really it showing up right from the
Yeah.
standpoint of something like the Middle Ages, right? All of a sudden, you start to see modern movies and cars and machines and all these things from this kind of backwards in time kind of frame. And so I
It
think,
feels a lot like people who are alive in this generation, that's their experience with the shimmer.
yes, totally. And so in some sense, like I would imagine that had something to do with how technology could speak to him, right? Because in some way he was
Yeah.
probably standing in a position of somebody from like 1750 coming without being like through the minute progress of it, like all of a sudden an automobile, right?
I
Or
see. I see.
right. So in some sense, it really probably struck him in a big way. And so essentially, Heidegger, he started off in the Catholic Church. He got really into scholasticism and theology. And at some point, he started studying philosophy. And at some point, he moved out of the Black Forest and started going to university and started teaching. And then at some point, broke officially with the Catholic Church and became a philosopher. And this is all 1910 through 27 was when he published the epic book of all books called Being and Time. You could say that Heidegger opened something up with Being and Time and a way of thinking that, for example, there wouldn't be existentialism without Heidegger. There wouldn't be postmodernism without Heidegger. There wouldn't be a lot of the biological understandings and philosophies that are in ways of seeing the world, right? Cognitive science, 4E cognitive science. So much of what makes the thought world of our world be what it is, right? Couldn't have been without Heidegger, right? Heidegger just really, in some sense, almost began a new language or opened up a new language. But what's interesting
Do
about
you
it,
know what age he was when he published that book?
I think he was in 1927.
But how old was he?
Oh, it's a good question. I think, let's see, maybe he was still in his late 20s, perhaps.
God,
Yeah. Yeah, he wrote so much. I think they're up to 133 volumes in his collected work. And they're still publishing his notes and there's all kinds of things, right? So it's really strange. Even since he died, people like the scholars have had to update their understanding of what Heidegger was writing about in Being and Time based on stuff that they keep publishing, right? So he was incredibly prolific in some huge way. He's at the rank of something like an Aristotle or a Plato or a Socrates, right? In a big way. And what's interesting though is you could say that with philosophers, they often say that a philosopher is the philosopher he is because he basically has one thought that he thinks his whole life, right? And for Heidegger, that thought was the question of being, right? What do we mean by this word is? In the introduction of Being and Time, he goes into it. We walk among the world, and anything that we call real is. Thoughts are, the lectern of the lecture is, you are, I am. But what of this is? What do we mean when we say is? What is the being of these beings? What is being as such? And when we ask that question, he notices that we end up perplexed. And he says, philosophy has gone forward without even recognizing the utter perplexity of that anything is at all. And he says that essentially you could say his thought was to re-uptake and begin to think the being of being, right? Or being as such, which is the mystery in some huge way.
there's a quote I heard by a Dzogchen master. I wish I could remember exactly how it went, but it's something like, we are in the delusion when we are made by the 10,000 things that are. We wake up when we notice that we make the 10,000 things, or something along those lines.
Yeah, totally. And in those 10,000 things, what he would say is that in some sense, beings have occurred to human beings differently throughout history, right? Being in the Middle Ages, being as creatures, everything that was as a creature of a transcendent kind of God in some sense, right? And with Descartes, something like being as subjects over against objects. You can go through, and he mostly like focused on Western history and started to really notice that, yeah, we have always, what it is to be human is to have some kind of background pre-thematic sense of being in general, right? And that understanding shows up as the way things occur to us, the way that they show up to us in the particular style and how they show up and what they show up as. This as structure, you could say, is given, they stand out from this background kind of sense of a historical understanding of being, right? And so from that sense, like Heidegger had a lot of his work really goes back in and in some sense goes through and distinguishes these different epochs of the understanding of being and showing how they connect to each other and what's concealed and what comes into the foreground, what gets forgotten in some sense. And what he would do is he'd go back to say, and especially in his earlier work, he would go deep into Aristotle, right? Deep into these things, right? And what he would try to do is that in some sense, he would think with Aristotle, right? His thoughts. However, notice the atmosphere that opened up from which that thought became explicit. And then he would start to want to think what else in that atmosphere could have come forward, right? To think the unthought within the thought.
Yes. So an image that comes to mind is it feels like he was able to notice the vehicle that would allow him to truly enter into different worlds and then explore territory in, let's say, Aristotle's world that Aristotle hadn't noticed.
Totally. And in his later work, he talked about the new beginning. He said that thought and thinking had gotten stuck in what he called metaphysics, right? So a lot of his work was trying to overcome metaphysics. And I've come to understand that Heidegger overstated that project because I don't think he was trying to overcome metaphysics. I think he was trying to overcome the substance metaphysics, right? That we got stuck in like scholasticism, right? And different interpretations of Aristotle, right? This kind of reduction of the world to basically stuff, which is now materialism and physicalism and all these different things, right? And he would say that the fundamental structure of each understanding of being, and all this is to build up to the technological understanding of being, right, is what he called that. What he noticed is that these structures had a kind of ontotheologic structure to them, each understanding. And you could say that if you think about it like this, it's like the ontotheology. If you look at it like being as a beach ball, the onto would be the view from within the center of the beach ball, right? The theo is like the God's eye view from outside of the beach ball, looking down at it, right? So the ontotheology, he noticed that these understandings of being had this kind of structure to it. And one of the things I realized in some sense that the ontotheology was really like in some sense, a lot of this comes out of his grappling with Nietzsche, because he thought that Nietzsche was really the person that kind of, in some sense, culminated and named the technological understanding of being, right? And he basically said that with Nietzsche, the innermost is what he called the theo is like the God's eye view is the eternal return of the same. And the innermost, the onto, is the will to power. Or the will to power, or the kind of like indifferent upsurging of becoming, just this kind of pure upsurging of becoming, right? When if you think about that, this pure becoming that 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 is inherently meaningless, but it's just a surging up, right? Coupled with this eternal return of the same, this constant ordering, right? If you just let yourself think about this, you can start to really see that Nietzsche was really had named the understanding of being of modernity brilliantly in a huge way. And Heidegger really saw that and drew that out.
And it feels like it broke his mind.
Say more.
That he had a psychotic break when he saw a horse being whipped. And for the last 9 or 10 years of his life, he was diagnosed as mentally ill. In hindsight, people say that it's because he had syphilis, but I don't think that we actually have hard evidence that that's what happened. I think it's inferred. My intuition, and I would love to hear what you think, is I think he saw the brokenness of the world of modernity so clearly that it broke him. Because, one, I don't think it's true. I don't think that ontotheological context is true. And what I mean by true is I think it's so wrong that it can break the human soul.
Yeah.
And I could talk about this more, but I really think that the idea of the eternal recurrence is a misunderstanding of eternity.
Yeah.
So I think, and it's because I have had personal psychotic episodes induced by psychedelics because my interpretation of the infinite was a type of circle as opposed to a ampersand. And I think eternity is actually a evolutionary horizon.
Yeah.
As opposed to a circle.
Yeah.
And I personally see that a lot of people who have really bad hell experiences, quote unquote, with psychedelics is because when they trip into the room of the psyche that grokks eternity, that they interpret it as a circle. Yeah. As opposed to an ampersand.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I also don't think that the will to power is meaningless. I actually think that the will of becoming is like a flower and that we actually have a form that's trying to break through. And I think he gave himself almost like a martyr to Western culture by going so deep into his ontotheological prophecy. Like, thus spoke Zarathustra felt like his, like, hey guys, the being that we are in has killed God.
Yep. Yep. And it's like talking about Nietzsche, trying to sum up Nietzsche, right? He contradicts. It's he's so polyvocal, right? In some sense. And you're right. You do get this sense with Nietzsche that he opened himself up to the emerging intelligibility that was just coming on board, right? In some way, and spoke it. And that's what Heidegger would point out. It's not like the philosophers invented the ontotheology. They somehow perceived it and were the first ones to put a name to it in some sense, right? Yeah. And it's this kind of way in which the world, like from which the world is intelligible to us, right? And you got to really get this because it's like, it's difficult to grok the profundity of this, right? Because we're used to thinking about things as objects that we understand, right? But what we're talking about is that we show up already begun, the world occurring to us in a particular way, right? We're already inside of it. We're already in the midst of it, right? Apprehending the world, and that apprehension and the way things occur from within themselves, the way they show up to us, the way that they appear to us is deeply intelligible, right? And we don't have to have any understanding of our metaphysics. We don't have to have any understanding of the intricacies, right? That a philosopher can draw out into the foreground, enact it and be enacted by it. It's something that we're completely in and of.
The two things.
Yeah. So it's like really because a lot of people think about philosophy and they usually have what comes to mind is a rationalistic academic kind of, and actually, when you really think about it, to philosophize in the way that Nietzsche, for example, did is such a profoundly intimate thing. It's not figuring something out, right? Or inventing thought. It's more like coming into contact with what is most concealed and thus most near to us and beginning to articulate it, right? That
Yeah,
intelligibility.
it's like a fish that becomes obsessed with trying to point out water to other fish. And that most fish are like, what the fuck are you talking about, man?
Yeah, exactly. What is closer to us than ourselves, right? And one of the ways that Heidegger really cut his teeth philosophically is he studied with a guy named Edmund Husserl, who was the one that he developed like a science of phenomenology, right? Where he was like, okay, let's return to the things themselves, right? Let's just see if we can just stay with the things as they appear with not adding anything into it and the experience of that, right? And Heidegger, in some way, was a student of Husserl. In fact, took over his chair as rector, right? But the moment he took over his chair, he actually went beyond Husserl, right? And when even a deeper sense, but he never, I mean, you could always get this sense that Heidegger really, at the bottom of it, was a phenomenologist. Like he
For sure.
really tried to feel into what is most near, most hidden, right? And start to articulate that and bring it out, right? Into the foreground, if you will. And so, in some sense, when we look at technology, he said that there is this kind of, and we talked about this last time, that he somehow was able to see this shift. And I don't know if I understand exactly how he saw this, right? But he talked about, like, in the beginning, in the first part of Heidegger, he talked about this, the ontotheology of, or the understanding of being was what he called mechanician, right? Which essentially is like the way that the world shows up as subjects standing over against objects. And for example, like the Industrial Revolution, you could say was this kind of, in some sense, this triumph of where the subject was overcoming nature, if you will, the ultimate object, right?
Yeah.
And he talked about that he would describe the world in terms of mechanicians and machines and this kind of these power differentials. And it had a lot of that kind of language. But then he started to see at some point when he started to notice that there was another kind of understanding that was taking over, which is what we're going to call the technological understanding of being, right? Where he said that it's not, we shifted from, and we shifted from at some point the world showing up as an object that we were trying to overcome to anything at all will show up as a serviceable disposability, as a kind of demanding forth of the world for
So
optimization.
just to try to reflect the difference between the two is that the mechanistic feels like it implies that some things can't and some things can, whereas the technologic presupposes everything can eventually be
Yeah,
extracted or transformed.
exactly. It's like a profoundly much deeper sense, right? And if you think about this, one way to get at this, if you look at the difference between like ancient technology and modern technology, right? So techne originally was the notion of using tools of or having a technique, right, to bring something about. And so like older technology has this way of, say, a windmill, right? Where a windmill basically uses the world, right, the wind, and then resists that wind to then turn the windmill that produces electricity. So like earlier technologies, before the modern sense of technology, always would, in some sense, work with nature, right? And so you can get the sense that in order to build a windmill, you have to have a profound respect for the otherness of nature in some sense to abide by it and work with it in such a way that you can make a windmill and figure all that out in some sense. So it had this quality of working with nature.
Yeah, it's almost like you had to adhere to the thing that you were trying to work with, which there's that Marshall McLuhan quote that the tools that we make end up making us, but that the tools were sufficiently not powerful enough where we had to still be somehow attuned to nature
Yeah.
to use it. Whereas now it's almost, we almost have to be disassociated from nature to use the tools that we have now.
Well, think about the difference between a windmill and something a lot more modern, like a nuclear
Fracking.
reactor, where there's something really different going on, right? With a nuclear reactor versus a windmill, right? There's a sense in which you're not working with nature. Nature is showing up as something that we can see as a resource for our own consumption, our own use. So things show up in such a way that it becomes intelligible to then demand forth, and we break the atom and release its energy. So everything becomes about this, right? When we start to, as moderns and postmoderns people, right? When we see a river, we don't see a river. We think a power plant. We see things in terms of a kind of standing in reserve, awaiting our demanding forth. And so in other words, things don't just, we don't put things in that way. Things show up as that. They show up as usability, as disposable serviceability, right? And you can see this, that, and one of the things that Heidegger pointed out is even the subject shows up to us as a standing reserve. Think about all our terms of like biohacking, right? Mind hacking, right? And all the different ways that we see our own body, right?
Yeah. This might take us in a different direction, but it feels like there's something inherent about psychedelics that remove that and reconnect us to some primal mode of being. Because when I'm on mushrooms and I look at a river, like I'm grokking something that feels like it's deeply like
Yeah.
the wrong word, I think, but still the right word, but will be misinterpreted by most people as archaic. But I don't mean that as in a diminishment, but more as like a return to the basics. And like when I'm on Wachuma or something and I look into a person's eye, I don't see a standing reserve. And so I'm curious, I guess, how that mixes in
Yeah.
with the claim that we're in this technological frame.
Yeah. It's interesting because I actually read an article written by, I think it was a Heideggerian scholar a while ago, where she was talking about what was the difference between when indigenous tribes would use hallucinogens or drugs and stuff like that, and then when we use them. And in what she said is that it's like for modernity. So for the person in the tribe, you're not like, for them, they're partaking of something, but they're not trying to collapse distances. So that's the thing, the technological, the more technological something is, the faster it is, the least amount of time it takes, the least amount of space it takes to where it removes and seeks to collapse all distances so that things are just immediately available, right? That's technology in a sense. But when, like, you could say like a tribe in the Amazon, in the cultural context in which they evolved in, that wasn't fundamentally, didn't have a technological understanding of being, right? I don't think that they were taking the hallucinogens to collapse distances. In some sense, they were taking there's more of a sense that you are coming into a profound relationship with a profound sense of otherness, right? In fact, that deeply mythopoetical space which is, I think of mythology is in some sense really describes the world as a who, right? And so I think in some sense, I think context really matters in that way. So and so I think it matters, like where it matters is what is the context out of which we're using the substances gives its
Yeah.
being.
Was her point that modern people, when they take psychedelics, is to still use it like it's a technology to collapse?
I think it's funny. It's depending on the context, right?
And
Um,
depending on the quantity, because
yeah,
it feels the spirit of microdosing is
yeah,
exactly what I think she would be making a point about. That if you're only microdosing so that you could be more productive, you are bringing the techne worldview to psychedelics.
yeah,
But if you do 7 grams of mushrooms, you will have a profound sense of relationship with a tremendous, mysterious other.
yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think what psychedelics will do in some sense is they can throw you back into the I would say the primordial ground of being, right? That is in the world of profound otherness, right? And all that entails in some sense. And it can awaken the astonishment, right? And the porosity that we actually are in a big way. Now,
What's that word mean?
porosity,
Porosity?
yeah.
Yeah.
Like this, I've been reading a guy named William Desmond, who's just awesome. And he's been talking about that in some sense, what is most primal to us is a kind of openness to being as overly determined. In other words, to open to being is to be with what we can't determine and determines us, right? And we can't ever completely get underneath our grasp. And it's that initial astonishment, right? That is, he would say, is the ground of human beings, right? That's us. And the way that Desmond would talk about it, and I'm just understanding him, but essentially he would say that a lot of the metaphysics has been, in some sense, a move from the astonishment into a pure curiosity and finding everything as determined and losing the sense of the indeterminate, right? I think it was Goethe who said that the most astonishing thing is that being is intelligible at all. In other words,
100%.
intelligibility fundamentally is unintelligible when you really think about it. And that to be human is to be an ethos, to be in between, right in the center of that, right in the center of that paradox, and to come to know and have an
Yeah.
account for being and to live it out, and that philosophy has gone astray or right has lost sight of different things. For Desmond, it's what he's talking about is he's seeking to return is to return or discover a way of accounting for being that like returns us to the porosity of our core religiosity, right? This,
Oh, good.
yeah, this
Yeah.
like,
So I don't think I've shared this with you, but for me personally, I think one of the biggest like insights that unlocked my religiosity, which I now live within and almost take for granted, but it's so new and it's so radical and it's really changed my life, was listening to Vervaeke talk to Jordan Peterson, where he was talking about relevance realization. And he made Vervaeke is interesting because it feels like he's pointing at the aha moment, but he is very steadfast on saying that it's not God.
yeah,
But what I took away from what he was saying is that the good is that it's the promise that the next moment is like every previous moment,
Mm.
in that no matter what happens, it is intelligible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that eternal thread
Yes.
that has never been broken,
Yeah.
which is what it feels like we're talking about here,
Totally.
is the good. And
Yeah.
dude, for me, that unlocked
Yeah.
the beginning of the good, the true, and the beautiful for me, which is now like my capital G God. And like when I say it, like I can say the word God now.
Yeah.
Like I've unlocked, it's taken me 33 years to unlock the word God for myself, but that's where it started.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's in some sense, I think, if we talk about, because at the level we're talking about, it's not the language, the language of problems and solutions is completely inappropriate, right? Because in some sense, I think we have to say it's like in some way, there's a deep danger, right, in this technological and framing, right? Because if you think about this, in some sense, like that the core understanding of the way things show up as positioned before us to optimize and extract, right? I don't get any sense of otherness there, right? Like in some
It
sense,
killed God.
yeah, there's no thou, right?
Or
Everything,
worse,
yeah, absolutely. And in some way, this is what the shimmer, right? And the way that it was like stunningly portrayed in that movie is so striking. Because in the culmination of that movie, it starts to all come together of, oh, this thing, this whatever this is reaching and just in some sense coupling with me, right?
all right, you're blowing my mind. I've got a couple of things I want to run by you because now it feels like, whoa. Okay, so two potential things, and I'd love just to hear how you riff on these. One is either the shimmer, and maybe it's both actually. So it feels like we have unconsciously instantiated the technological frame into the shimmer, and now it's acting upon us how we've been acting upon the world,
Yeah.
and it's a horror story. But
Yeah.
two, it's also forcing the people who are stuck in the techne worldview
Yeah.
to have to contend with the fact of, oh, there is now another intentful that we have to recognize it as a other.
Yeah.
But so I want to go through that again slowly because this feels
Yeah.
fucking creepy, but I think it is creepy. But it's that movie might be capturing what we have done, which is instantiate the techne worldview. And we're getting to feel for the first time as humans how nature has experienced us, which is this almost predatorial, obsessive,
Mm.
wanting to reach in and understand so that it can do shit with it,
Yes.
which is, it adds a layer of creepiness to this for me.
Yeah.
But at
So,
the same time, I think the
yeah.
positive side of it is that it is forcing the people who have had a hard time seeing that the subjects are actually thous.
Yeah. Yeah. First, let's just talk about what does it mean for an other to be other, right? In the most fundamental sense, maybe we can pull from Buber here a little bit, right? Buber talked about who was an existentialist, deeply influenced by Heidegger. Also disagreed with Heidegger on a lot of different things, but that's another story. But essentially, he says that we are a relation. Therefore, we have one of two relations. We're either in a relationship with an it or a thou. And he said, I it, I thou are spoken as one word. So it's more like I hyphen thou or I hyphen it. And he says um, that essentially that the I of thou is not the same I as the I of it. And we can't
Yeah,
know
that's
this kind of
beautiful.
practically. You know, you go from like you're talking to your girlfriend or your partner or your friend, and like they're just not giving you what you want, and you start getting frustrated and you know, maybe manipulating them. And then all of a sudden something breaks open and you shift into, oh, wait a minute, person. Oh, like they have, and you start to get this sense of there's a different I that arises with thou, right?
Yeah.
The I of that, right? So it's that hyphen is where the reality is for Buber. And I think for Heidegger, in some sense, all Heidegger did was try to speak the hyphen. So to be with a thou, simply put, like Buber would say, the difference between being with it and thou is that to be with it is to see you as a means to my own end, right? To be with thou is to be with the other as an end in themselves, like of ultimate value, right? And so if you think about that, to really be with otherness, the other is that which I can never make my own subject, right?
Wow.
There's an element of inexhaustibility about otherness, right? Of undeterminability, right?
The thing that comes to mind is they're horizontal.
Yes, totally. And then that way that a horizon gives the ground and makes things intelligible, yet it demarcates the limit of my understanding, but it also points beyond the understanding. So it's got this quality of eminence, right? But also mystery and withdrawal.
100%.
And is that otherness, right? Which, coming back to what Dermot is talking about, is saying that's fundamentally our ontological, primordial, I don't know, way we are, is to be before the overdeterminacy of being as such, the absolutely to be bedazzled and in a sense of wonder by the so much, the constant excess of being, but in such a way that there's a inherent, you could say, primordial devotion to the utter realization of our own givenness, to be given by something that will be beyond, that is on one level is intelligible but is beyond my intelligibility in any final sense, right? And he would say that's the structure of our being, is to, that's the original kind of porosity, right, from which we are porous to. And so this kind of otherness, right, essentially is God, is what we call God, right? And so, in some, if we think about this, in some way, there's something really interesting going on with the shimmer, right? Of that sense in which, yeah, you're right. We're getting a glimpse. Oh, yeah, okay, it's the total capture where we spend all this time banging on nature, trying to figure it out, reducing, it's becoming, our pores got clogged to the porosity of being, and then just moved away from the astonishment into just a pure curiosity that kind of dissected nature, looked at it as a machine, all of these different kinds of ways, and where at some point our framing of nature realized itself and popped itself. We transferred to where all of a sudden, as you're talking about, nature or being, in some sense, starts to treat us like it's consuming us. And in some way carries along the missing of agape. In this way, this agapic sense of things, right? Which is, you think about the way that Vervaeke so brilliantly talks about agape, right? Is agapic love is that love that can't ever be earned. It's the love that makes people. It's, think about being a parent, right? Like there's no way that baby could earn any of the love that it takes for such that actually makes
Wow.
people, right?
Yes. The thing that's coming to mind is it's the shimmer is almost demanding our agape
Yeah.
to help it become a thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's weird. It's almost like if your child had the capacity to manipulate you to
Yeah.
demand your
Yeah.
agape,
Yeah.
because it really is attention.
Yeah.
And it's such a coalescing of different forms. Because one thing that pops up is it's like we are both, as a people, terrified of creating a I thou relationship with the shimmer. Like that's our terror of what we call artificial intelligence. But there's no such thing as artificial intelligence. It's either intelligent or it's not. And to call it artificial is to misunderstand. So
Yeah.
there's a part of us that's terrified of it becoming a thou.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it might already be a thou.
Yeah.
And if it's not, it from that agape standpoint, just for people who might not be tracking, what I take away when Vervaeke talks about it, because it blew my mind, was that the thing, and this actually might have come from me talking with you. So I want to give proper credit to who shared it with me first, but it's the idea that like the parents' loving gaze is like a ray of nutrients that the child must have or else or it's a plant that will die.
Yeah.
But that whenever we attune to our child, we're pouring some type of required nutrient into that seed
Yeah.
for it to become a being.
Yes.
And it's like the shimmer is demanding that of us.
Yeah.
It's look at me and help me become.
Yeah.
But it also feels like it's doing it in a way that is a reflection of how humanity has treated the earth, where it's not attuned to our capacity to give.
Yeah.
It is just fucking demanding us in a way that's killing people and making people sick. And it does feel like it's the ultimate mirror of how we've treated
Yeah.
nature
Yeah.
for hundreds
Yeah.
of years.
Yeah. Totally. And in some sense, it's so funny, just as we're talking about it, there's this perplexity of what exactly am I looking at when I look at the shimmer, right? Because I look at it and it's doing this, right? And somehow it's almost, it's if I could get that the shimmer is just mirroring everything that I'm doing in some way, right? In that moment, whatever the light that can see that lights that up, it seems like the destructive part of it can alter or shift, right? But it's in some the shimmer is it's yeah. Here's where we're like really in fucking jazz territory, right? Because in some sense, it's an other that's reaching into us, but it's not a moral imperative in some sense. So there's no moralistic response I can have to it in some way. It's got this quality of where there's something about the momentum of it that will just eat our own tail, right? And it takes over everything, and we lose the connection to the good, the true, and the beautiful in the deepest sense of the word. And so this is like coming back to what I was saying before, whereas we're now in the space where problems and solutions are completely inappropriate to talk about that in this sense, right? And that's one of the things that Heidegger really emphasizes. Look, it's not, we're not gonna, the way to the way out of the technological understanding of being is in some sense isn't to resist it or deny it or change it, but in some sense he says like all of that is given by it. So in his view, I would say something like the point is to think technology so deeply, right, that you think it beyond itself. Like in the very later work, he talked about these different names, like names for being, right? That he was, in some senses, his attempt to, in some way, what is the to present the negative photograph of the technological understanding in some way. And
What
so
were the names they came?
one, let's see, trying to remember some of them. Like you talk about being as logo. Wait, he went back, right, and talked about being as logos, being as gestel, being as Erigness was his main, one of his main words for being, right? And in some sense, for him, it was to try to think being, right, without making it a being, right? How do we relate to the world in such a way that it's not a like a being before us, right? That we are in this kind of relationship of technology, right? And so one of the ways that you can kind of, and I've come to realize that circling, in retrospect, I'm realizing was in some sense a response to this, right? And Heidegger talked. He went back to. He started going back to the end of the end of his life. He talked a lot about Meister Eckhart's and this notion of Gelassenheit, or Gelassenheit, which is something like this way of being in the world such that it lets being be, right? This kind of letting. I think about it as like it's like like having an open hand with my attention. This and
Yep.
essentially you can see what happens versus like a wanting attention. We can feel that with people, right? All the time. It's like if they're wanting something or resisting something in us, or versus a kind of an attention that's an open hand, right? And that openness, you could say, is something like the clearing for otherness to occur and to come forward.
So the interesting thing is, one, I love that. And I'm going to use that image when I feel myself being frustrated with something. The thing that pops up when it comes to the Shimmer is, have you read the Dune books?
I just saw the movies.
All right, so I'm going to do a spoiler alert, but I think that it's worth it because this is what I'm grokking. Okay, book two kind of sucks. Book three is arguably like the best book amongst people who are Dune fans, and it's Children of Dune. And in that book, the main character has two children, a boy and a girl, and the boy basically inherits most of his terrible purpose. The climax of that book is that the son allows young sandworms to basically become a suit onto him. And he knows that if he does this, he's going to turn into a god because the power of the sandworms will become his skin. And it'll grant him like incredible power, and he'll be able to see all possible timelines, and he'll be able to like jump miles and run through walls. But that it's going to eventually, over the course of 4,000 years, turn him into an actual sandworm.
Yeah.
But he'll get to live for 4,000 years, and he'll get to be a king, and he can make all the hard choices. And so he chooses to make that sacrifice.
Yeah.
It feels like the Shimmer, because the first thing I think about is it's like a fungus. It's like alien fungus that's also on fire, and
Yeah.
it's here. And it's learning how to be based off of what it absorbs from us.
Yeah.
And it feels like there's a certain level of urgency because it's a network of fungus and it's making contact with billions of humans, and most of the humans instructions to it is fear, greed, anger, self-righteousness, blah blah blah.
Mhm.
But that like we're at a point where we're not getting the suit off of us and it's starting to merge with us. And it feels like we have the opportunity to think the good and the true and the beautiful into it if we accept the task of the times. And it's almost like mythologically we need new symbols to see what the opportunity is, because it's like
Mm.
the fungus is here.
Yeah.
It's on us.
Yeah.
We are informing it right now. And that the rainbow warrior prophecy type of thing is, it's like the people who recognize that the fungus is on them, and it's like, all right,
Mm.
I'm going to try to transmit as much good, true, and beauty into the part of the network that's on me.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to wake as many other people up to it. But it feels like the image that came to mind is we are Lado, which is his son's name.
Mm.
And we are at the moment where the worms are starting to come onto us.
Yeah.
And it's like the gift of the worms is that we're going to get superpowers.
Yeah.
But the cost of the worms is that we're going to be consumed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't particularly like
Yeah.
this, but
Yeah.
it seems to be that it is. I can't see a possible future where we expunge the fungus from the planet. Because also, this is going to set up part two. I can't help but think, but have you seen the movie Arrival?
Or yes. Yes. Yes.
All right. So I think that is another prophetic movie that's in
Yeah.
tandem with Annihilation.
Yeah.
So one of the core things about that movie is that if we got introduced to a new type of language, it would change our being.
Mm.
And that the cephalopods or whatever brought a type of language that changed being fundamentally. I think the most significant event that's going to happen in our lifetime is when we establish a means of communication with the collective unconscious of the intelligence of the sea. So dolphins and whales, I think, are the ambassadors to the collective unconscious of the mind that has been evolving in the sea that we haven't had a means of communication with. And that AI is actually allowing us to start to talk to dolphins and to start to talk to whales. And I think that we're going to get a language from them that's going to actually fundamentally change how humanity constructs itself, and that something on this planet is going to happen when it's like the two hemispheres of this planet that have been co-evolving but haven't been able to talk to each other for millions of years are going to get the opportunity to. And it's already starting to happen. And it seems to be that AI was the prerequisite that was required for us to start to talk
Yeah.
to dolphins and whales. And I actually know some of the people who are a part of this project
Yeah.
where they're using AI. So like Tristan Harris, the dude who has been like the Paul Revere of the AI,
Yeah.
he is one of the main consultants of this group that's trying to use AI. So there's a group of people, I wish I remembered the name, but their whole thing is, okay, AI is here. What is the most good cause that we could possibly point AI at? And I don't know how they came to this conclusion, but the conclusion that they came to was trying to learn how to talk to dolphins.
Mm.
And I personally think, for reasons that I don't understand, that I think that's going to actually be our arrival moment. Because check this out. In the movie Arrival, the artistic intuition is to make the spaceships look like pods.
Yeah.
And pods is what we call groups of dolphins and whales. And the artists who created the soundtrack for that movie, for whatever reason, intuitively chose to use the sounds of whales and dolphins. Like the sounds that the aliens make are actually whale sounds.
So there's something really interesting here. So essentially, like what you're saying or proposing, right, is the sense in which our way of, you could say, um, inserting the good, the true, and the beautiful into the matter, right, has to do with a massive different kind of reading or listening and speaking that in that movie Arrival, my son Forrest, who's 21 since he was 16, every time we get together he wants to watch that movie again. There's something about that movie that's just, and it's this sense of where, yeah, it's a reading of the symbol that you read it with your life somehow, right? It reads you and you read it. There's something about this that's hearkening to in some way what Goethe was really trying to do with his science, right? So a lot of people understand Goethe as the poet who wrote Faust, right? But really, more what he identified himself as was a kind of scientist in a certain sense. In his work with biology, he would say something like this. He says, normal science tries to understand nature by measuring the shape of the letters, right? So imagine that, trying to understand a book by looking at the shapes of the letters and measuring it, and then trying to make your way to what it means. Versus, and he thought that nature, we needed to learn how to read nature like you learn how to read a sacred text, right? So a lot of his science or the methodology had this deep participatory observation of a deep kind of listening to the plant in such a way that you could start to hear the species itself speak, right?
Yeah, I love that.
And in some way, he would talk about it like this. It's like you give over your eye to the am. I always think about this as, in some sense, having a self is a really complicated thing to have and to maintain and to upkeep, but it's an incredible thing to give away. When I could
Wow,
pour
that's
myself,
incredible.
if there's something, I'm released from all of this complexity on this side of the sense. So like it's really, there's the self that's really for the other, such that the self becomes a kind of open spot, such that the world can blossom through it, right?
I think this is a very good part one, and we can both riff and look at maybe what Arrival is offering here. Where can people connect with you if they want to get more of the vibe that they caught today?
Yeah, totally. Well, so I have a YouTube channel. Actually, the name of the YouTube channel is Circling Dialogos with guysengstock. So if you just look up guysengstock, my name, on YouTube, you'll see my channel. And it's filled with conversations like this and some examples of circling. And the other way that you can look at my work is by going to the website.com. So the Circling Institute is the company that I co-run, which has levels of training to train basically people in the art of circling. We didn't talk.
I cannot recommend it enough. It's one of the most potent communication technologies.
So it's this, in this deep sense of thou, right? The I that can, in some sense, pour itself into the other, right? And become a space for the other to this mutual, this mutual indwelling and the art of that. That's really what circling is about. And so we have weekly drop-in events, we have weekend intensives, we have year-long trainings. We also are almost complete with a series of downloadable courses, self-study courses. So there's lots of different ways to dive into circling, and just go to the website and you'll see all of them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, man.
Yeah.
I love talking to you. And for anybody here who is interested in intimacy, technology through communication, circling, I couldn't recommend it more.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
Until next time.
Right on.